The sea was calm. But inside the Navy destroyer, tension crackled like electricity. A fleet-wide exercise was underway, live missiles locked, radars primed, and a young lieutenant eager to prove himself stood at the helm, ready to give the fire command. But just as the countdown began, a voice rose from the back of the room, gravelly, uninvited. "You're targeting the wrong coordinates," said the janitor. He wasn't wearing a uniform. He was holding a mop. His hair was gray, his back slightly stooped. And yet, in that moment, he spoke with the authority of a man who had seen too much. "To stay silent," the lieutenant scoffed. "This isn't your place, old man." But the veteran didn't flinch, because he knew what that radar signature meant. It wasn't a dummy ship, it was an Allied vessel, of course due to a system glitch. One missile, one mistake, and dozens of lives would be lost. What happened next would turn a forgotten sailor into a legend. This is not just a military tribute. It's a story of battlefield courage, long after the war had ended, a story of soldier sacrifice, unsung heroes, and the moment a captain made a choice that changed everything. The ship was called USS Davenport, a guided missile destroyer, known for its precision and speed. It sliced through the ocean like a scalpel, its gray hull gleaming under the July sun. On board, the mood was intense but focused. Today's fleet exercise was no ordinary drill. For many of the young officers, this was their first time operating under live-fire protocols. Every move, every decision, would be watched, judged, and recorded. Among the buzzing control room staff and uniformed personnel, no one paid much attention to the older man in blue overalls. He moved quietly, pushing a mop across the polished floor. He kept his head down, barely speaking. Most didn't even know his name, but if they looked closely, they'd notice his posture wasn't quite right for a janitor. His back was straight, his boots still moved with balance, and his eyes scanned every panel with quiet familiarity. His name was Walter Briggs, a Vietnam-era Navy technician, who had once manned sonar systems before most of the crew had even been born. Walter never asked for special treatment. He didn't tell stories unless someone asked. And even then, he was humble, never the hero, always part of the team. The truth was, Walter had lived enough combat to last a lifetime. After retiring, he found peace in silence and purpose in service. Any service when offered a part-time custodial job aboard a Navy vessel during its port duties and exercises, he accepted, not for the money, but to feel close to the ocean again. But today wasn't a routine cleaning shift. Today, something felt off. As he wheeled his cart past the Combat Information Center kick, Walter glanced at the radar feed. He noticed an anomaly, a slow-moving signal, drifting too close to the designated target zone. It was faint, erratic, almost easy to miss. But Walter's instincts, sharpened by years of battlefield courage and near-death experiences, kicked in. He knew that signature. It wasn't a decoy ship. It wasn't part of the drill. It was an actual vessel, an Allied reconnaissance boat, likely out of communication due to a scrambled frequency. He had seen this mistake before, decades ago, and the memory still haunted him. A friendly ship misidentified, lives lost, and silence ordered. Walter's hands clenched the mop handle. He stood frozen for a moment, torn between the role he was given on, the role he once held. But the weight of soldier sacrifice pressed on his conscience. If he stayed silent, men would die, and they'd die because no one listened to a janitor. Summoning his nerve, Walter pushed open the CIC door and stepped inside. "Excuse me," he said, quietly but firmly. The room went silent. Heads turned. At the center stood Lieutenant Marcus Hill, young, confident, and laser-focused. He narrowed his eyes at the interruption. Walter pointed at the screen. "That blip on the radar, it's not a decoy. It's a live vessel. Possibly a recon craft that lost comms." Hill's face tightened. "Who are you?" "Just a janitor," Walter replied. "But that signal, it's not behaving like a drone. I've seen this before." The room chuckled awkwardly. Hill's pride flared. "We've got this under control. Return to your duties." Walter didn't move. "If you fire that missile, you may be targeting friendlies." It was a line soaked in weight, in battlefield courage, in the quiet scream of someone who knew. Hill rolled his eyes. "Security, get him out." A couple of crewmen approached, but Walter stood tall. "Call the captain," he said, his voice steady now. "Call him now." Hill laughed bitterly. "You think I'm going to delay a live-fire drill because a janitor thinks he's some kind of radar whisperer?" But someone else in the room wasn't laughing. Petty Officer Ramirez, manning the radar station, had noticed the same anomaly. He had ignored it at first, but now that the old man had spoken, doubt crept in. Sir, Ramirez said hesitantly, the trajectory of that signalet is a little strange. It's not following any decoy pattern. Hill snapped back. Ramirez, stay in your lane. But Ramirez had seen the look in Walter's eyes. That wasn't fear. That was knowledge, the kind born from real war zones and blood-soaked waters. Walter took a breath. He didn't want to embarrass anyone. But lives were at stake. I served 18 years on sonar, he said quietly. Tracked submarines in the Pacific. I lost 6 good men when we misread a blip just like that one. If I'm wrong, I'll mop this entire ship with a toothbrush. But if I'm right, you'll fire on your own people. His words dropped like an anchor in the room. Ramirez looked to Hill. Hill hesitated. It was then that the door opened, and a calm but commanding voice spoke. What's going on here? Captain Elijah Monroe, tall and silver-haired, stepped in. His gaze swept the room, settling on Walter. Silence fell. Walter turned to face the captain. For a moment, 2 eras of military service stared at each other, one decorated by rank, the other weathered by time. Sir, Walter said, standing tall, I believe you're about to hit an Allied vessel. That radar blip doesn't match decoy behavior. Monroe looked at the screen, then at Ramirez, then at Hill. Ignore him, and people die, Walter added. Monroe didn't flinch. Lieutenant Hill, stand down the firing sequence. Get me visual confirmation now. Hill's face burned with frustration, but he obeyed. In that instant, rank didn't matter. Experience did. A minute later, the CIC lit up with new data. Optical feed confirmed it. An Allied recon ship, exactly where Walter had warned, of course. Out of comes. They had nearly committed friendly fire, and a janitor had stopped them. The room stood frozen, as if time itself bowed to the weight of what almost happened. On the screen, the live optical feed revealed the unmistakable outline of the Allied recon vessel, an aging patrol ship from the Pacific Fleet, drifting in the exact location Walter had pointed out. Its communication systems were clearly damaged, its signal faint and confused, but it was no ghost. It was real, and human lives were on board. Captain Monroe stepped closer to the screen, his jaw tight. He turned slowly, toward Walter, then to Lieutenant Hill, whose face had drained of color. You nearly killed our own, the captain said, his voice low, cold, and calm, and you ignored a warning that could have saved us from it. Hill opened his mouth to defend himself, but no words came. It wasn't just a mistake. It was a refusal to listen to a veteran, to experience, to a voice from the past that still held value. The captain turned to Walter. What's your name, sailor? Walter Briggs, sir. Former sonar technician, 2nd class. Monroe gave a single, slow nod. Welcome back aboard, Mr. Briggs. Those words, so simple, so human, carried the weight of a military tribute long overdue. For Walter, it wasn't about validation, it was about duty. But in that moment, a forgotten hero had been seen again. The captain wasn't done. Lieutenant Hill, I want a full report on how this misidentification occurred, and I want it by 1800 hours. Hill stiffened, jaw clenched, but he saluted. Yes, sir. As the room resumed activity, whispers followed Walter down the corridor. Not the usual mutters of dismissal or amusement, but hushed awe, respect. He wasn't just the janitor anymore. He was the man who saved lives. That evening, the captain invited Walter to his quarters. Not as a superior to a subordinate, but as one sailor to another. They shared coffee. No formalities. Monroe leaned back in his chair. I looked you up, Walter. Silver Star. 2 Navy Commendation Medals. Sonar lead during Operation Iron Wave. Walter chuckled. That was a lifetime ago. Funny thing about lifetimes, Monroe said. They tend to echo into the present when we need them most. There was silence for a while. Comfortable. Then Monroe leaned forward. Why didn't you ever come back into active duty? With your record, you could have trained a generation. Walter's face darkened, eyes drifting somewhere far away. I tried, he said quietly. After Vietnam, I came back to a country that didn't want to see what we'd seen. No one cared. My best friend didn't make it out of Da Nang. I lost more in the silence after war than I did during it, so I disappeared. Did odd jobs. Stayed out of command, but I could never leave the sea. Monroe nodded. He understood more than he let on. There's a generation of sailors on this ship who've never known war up close. The captain said. They train with screens, not scars. But you carry both. You reminded us all today that courage doesn't age. Walter looked down at his calloused hands, still dusted with cleaner from his earlier shift. I just did what needed doing. That, Monroe said, is the very definition of heroism. News of the near miss spread throughout the fleet faster than official reports. It wasn't long before Walter's name reached command channels. But the attention didn't change him. The next morning, he was back to mopping the decks, quietly, dutifully, till the captain issued a new order. Effective immediately, Mr. Briggs will be reinstated as a civilian radar consultant for this vessel, and any fleet operations in need of expert review. Walter's eyes widened. Captain, I appreciate it, but I don't need a title. You don't, Monroe replied, but this crew needs you. We're not honoring you because of one moment. We're recognizing you because you've never stopped serving. In the coming days, young sailors began approaching Walter with quiet questions, nervous admiration in their eyes. What made you know that was a real ship? How did you read the radar that fast? Weren't you afraid of getting punished for stepping in? Walter never gave lectures, he told stories. Real war stories. He didn't boast, he remembered. Faces, sacrifices, soldier bravery that never made the headlines. His emotional storytelling became an unexpected classroom. Every deckhand who listened to him left with a little more reverence in their stride. And perhaps that was the most heroic act of all, not the moment he saved a ship, but the moments after, when he poured quiet wisdom into young minds desperate to understand what service really meant. Back in the CIC, Lieutenant Hill was quieter now, humbled. One afternoon, he approached Walter on the observation deck. I was wrong, he said simply. Walter looked at him, then nodded. We all have to learn, Lieutenant. Just don't let pride be louder than your instincts. Or someone else's. Hill extended a hand. Walter shook it. That handshake was more than apology. It was the bridge between generations, between protocol and experience, between decorated officers and unsung heroes. Somewhere in the Pacific, a recon crew wrote a quiet letter of thanks. They had no idea who had intervened. All they knew was that the missile never came. They were alive because someone saw what no one else did, and spoke up. They didn't know it was a janitor. They didn't know it was a war hero. They didn't know it was Walter Briggs. But maybe that's the point of real heroism. Doesn't ask for applause. It just shows up. 2 weeks passed since the incident that turned a humble janitor into a savior. Life on the USS Davenport resumed its usual rhythm: morning drills, maintenance checks, data reports. But beneath the routine, something had shifted. The crew no longer looked past Walter Briggs. They looked to him. He hadn't asked for recognition. He didn't want a medal. He didn't even sit with the officers in the mess. He preferred the corner by the supply lockers, where he could sip black coffee from a worn thermos and listen, just listen. But stories began to surface. Someone mentioned that Walter once disabled an enemy torpedo, using only sonar misdirection during a rescue op in the South China Sea. Another said he'd pulled 2 sailors out of a burning Cums Bay after a fire broke out. No one knew how many of the tales were true, but the ones that were carried the weight of truth. What mattered more was that Walter didn't share these stories himself. He lived them. Quietly. One night, Chief Petty Officer Garcia, a hardened veteran himself, found Walter alone near the aft deck, watching the stars. Briggs, Garcia said. You ever think of writing it all down? Walter smiled. What for? Garcia shrugged. Because some of us need to remember, and the kids coming up, they don't get it yet. But they will. And when they do, they'll need your voice. Walter looked out at the endless dark sea, remembering friends lost beneath those waters. I don't need to be remembered, he said softly, but I'll be damned if I forget them. That's what kept him going. Not pride, not bitterness, but memory. A loyalty to the forgotten heroes, the ones who'd bled in silence, the ones who never got a welcome home. One afternoon, the ship received a surprise. Admiral Jonathan Reeves was arriving for an unannounced inspection. The crew scrambled. Everything had to be spotless, precise, perfect. Perfect. Walter kept working as usual, bucket in hand, boots echoing through the steel corridors. He had seen admirals before. The stars on their shoulders didn't impress him as much as how they treated the lowest-ranking sailor. But something unexpected happened. When Admiral Reeves came aboard, he didn't ask for the executive team first. He asked, "Where's the man who stopped the Davenport from friendly fire?" Murmurs spread. The officers looked at one another. You mean Lieutenant Hill, sir? Someone asked. No, Reeves said. I mean the man in overalls. Walter Briggs. Walter was found polishing a stairwell, His hands were wet with cleanser, but his eyes still sharp. When he saw the admiral, he wiped his palms on his uniform and stood up straight. Reeves approached and offered a salute. "I read the report," the admiral said. "You saw what no one else did. You spoke when it mattered. You honored your oath without wearing a uniform." Walter hesitated. Then slowly, he returned the salute. The moment felt like a ripple in time to generations colliding. The past finally given a place in the present. The admiral didn't stop there. "I've approved your reinstatement as a naval civilian consultant. You'll be working directly with Fleet Command on radar safety reviews and tactical training scenarios. If you accept, of course." Walter blinked. "That's a bit much for a janitor, sir." Reeves grinned. "That's too little for a hero, Mr. Briggs." Later that day, a ceremony was held in the hangar bay. Not a flashy one, Walter wouldn't have accepted that, but a sincere one. Officers, sailors, technicians, all gathered in silent respect. Captain Monroe spoke first. "Some men wear ribbons, some wear stars, and some, like Walter, carry their medals where no one sees them. In memory, in integrity, in action, today, we honor more than a man. We honor what the uniform is supposed to represent." Then Reeves stepped forward and pinned a small emblem on Walter's shirt. Not a traditional medal, but a custom insignia, a radar wave with a silver shield, a tribute to silent protectors. The admiral spoke only 6 words, for the moment that saved lives. The crowd applauded, but more than that, they stood taller. Something inside them shifted. This was military tribute at its finest, quiet, raw, real. That night, Walter didn't sleep. He walked the decks alone, hands in his pockets. His mind drifted back to Vietnam, to the screams over the radio, the sonar pings, the silence after a ship went dark. He had survived while others hadn't, and for years, he'd lived with that quiet guilt. But today felt different. Today, their memory lived on through him. He paused near the bow and whispered a few names into the wind, names no one else knew. Then he said, "You're not forgotten." The waves answered in their own language, washing gently against the hull. Meanwhile, back in the crew quarters, Lieutenant Hill sat staring at his tablet. He had pulled up Walter's old service record. Operation after operation. Lives saved, wounds taken. No commendation ever asked for. He closed the file and wrote one line in his personal log. "Pride nearly cost lives. A veteran saved us." I'll never ignore that voice again. That entry would shape Hill's career. It would keep him grounded long after his own promotions came. And years later, when he became a captain himself, he'd hang a photo of Walter Briggs on his office wall, not as decoration, but as a reminder of experience, of humility, of a man who once held a mop and saved a ship. The weeks that followed were quiet on the USS Davenport, but not silent. Something had shifted in the hearts of the crew, not just because of an avoided tragedy, but because of a lesson that would outlast their deployments, their ranks, even their time in uniform. Respect is not always worn on the shoulders. Sometimes, it's carried in silence. Walter Briggs became a figure of reverence, not out of fame or flash, but because his presence reminded them all of the invisible thread tying every generation of warriors together: experience, sacrifice, duty, and above all, humility. He walked the corridors the same way he had before, with quiet purpose. But now, every sir offered to him wasn't sarcastic or surprised, it was sincere. From fresh recruits to seasoned officers, everyone saw him for what he truly was: a real war hero, not lost to history, but finally remembered. One morning, a group of young sailors gathered in the mess hall, talking softly about radar procedures, drills, and how easily things could have gone wrong. Walter sat nearby, reading a weather report. One of them, a nervous 19-year-old named Henderson, turned to him. "Sir, do you ever think about what would have happened if you hadn't said anything?" Walter looked up, his eyes calm but deep. "Every day, weren't you scared to speak up?" Walter smiled faintly. "Of course I was. You think courage means you're not afraid. Courage means you speak through the fear because the cost of silence is too high." Another sailor asked, "What if they hadn't listened?" Walter paused. "Then I'd have kept speaking until someone did. Because real leadership isn't about who yells the loudest. It's about who refuses to stay silent when it matters most." They sat in silence, absorbing his words. That moment became a turning point for many of them. Years later, those same sailors would lead their own crews, and they would pass Walter's story down like scripture, not for glory, but as a reminder of what it means to serve with integrity. Back home, the story of Walter's act finally made its way to the local papers. A small column titled, "Veteran Janitor Saves Navy Ship from Friendly Fire. Captain Says His Actions Changed Lives." It wasn't national news. It didn't go viral. But it reached the people who needed it most. His daughter, who hadn't known the full extent of her father's service. A former crewmate, who had always wondered what happened to Briggs after the war. And a generation of forgotten veterans, men and women, who saw themselves in him. Quiet, brave, uncelebrated. Walter began receiving letters, dozens, then hundreds. One note read, "Thank you for reminding the world that we never stop being soldiers even when no one's watching." Another said, "You saved more than a ship. You saved our belief in what service really means." Walter read each one. Some he cried over. Some he folded into a box he kept beneath his bunk on the ship. But all of them reminded him, his story mattered. And not just his but the stories of every unsung hero. Every man and woman who stood tall in the shadows. On the final day of his consultancy, the Davenport's crew gathered again, this time, by choice. Captain Monroe gave no formal speech. Instead, he handed Walter a simple plaque. Not gilded, not flashy, just wood and steel. It read, "To Walter Briggs, for speaking when silence was easier. For seeing what others missed. For honoring the fallen by standing tall for the living." Walter took it in his hands and said, "Only this. I didn't come here to be a hero. I came to do my job." Turns out, they were the same thing all along. As he stepped off the ship, the crew saluted, not because he was leaving, but because he had served. Fully, quietly, unforgettably. Later that year, Walter returned to his modest home near the coast. He still walked to the docks every morning, still polished his boots, still carried himself like a sailor. And sometimes, when ships passed in the distance, he'd raise a hand in salute, not to be seen, but because heroes never stop honoring the Colvin when the world isn't watching.